Hi everyone, welcome back to another video of what's new in Veeam Data Cloud. So today I want to talk about everything that's going to happen in over the summer months really, so mainly August, and I also want to spend some time talking about Entra ID today, as I know I've promised that on a previous video. So just to take us through the Veeam Data Cloud portal, we've already seen this from a previous experience, but you can see here we've got the continue with Microsoft, continue with Veeam authentication methods. I just want to recall this out because when we're thinking about Entra ID, if we're protecting Entra ID, but then also accessing Veeam Data Cloud with Entra ID, we can create a catch-22 situation of, if I'm locked out of my Entra ID, well then how do I access Veeam Data Cloud to recover access to any of my data? And don't worry about that, that's why we have Veeam authentication as well. This is a Veeam provided authentication method. We still support things such as multi-factor authentication within this. Obviously the main trade-offs are you can't start looking at any centralized login into any SIM tools you might be using for Entra ID, and things such as in-tune device compliance status aren't going to be applicable because ultimately we're not using Entra ID. So what I'm going to do here is let's just dive in and have a look at Entra ID itself. So I will continue with Microsoft because everything's great in my Entra ID environment today. So you'll see here I've selected my account and then I get presented with a list of VDC organizations that I have. Now, again, a VDC organization does not equate to a tenant from an Entra ID perspective because we support license pooling. An organization is purely a group of any tenants that you may have. So you'll see here, I'm just going to go into my VDC demo environment. This will just take a moment to load and then I'll be greeted with a nice dashboard screen. So you can see here, I've got my Entra ID service and let's dive into that today. So as I was just saying, subscriptions, you don't need to worry about cutting and carving licenses for Entra ID between multiple tenants if you've got that. Now let's spend a moment to talk about tenants really and why we might have multiple. You do have the use case where organizations might have different tenants because they've got a dev test environment, but actually the most common thing I find is organizations that are going through mergers and acquisitions. There's this line where suddenly if you are the surviving company of a merger, then you have to bring all of the new company's assets under your policies, under your controls from day one. Now, in terms of migrating the Entra ID tenants together, the M365 environments, whilst that will be the ideal scenario, you're not going to achieve that the same day that you're now responsible for it. We'd like to think we could do that, but it's not going to happen. But don't worry, because you could add an additional tenant in here, and then that enables you to do things from our RBAC perspective, such as governing which tenants users have access to. And we'll come to that more in a moment. So for now, I'm just going to dive into my tenants. You can see here, I've got my Michael Paul dev tenant. You can see that I'm provisioned in UK South, and let's dive into manage. So what you'll see now is the service specific dashboard. You can see that the protection is enabled when my last backup has taken place and when my oldest backup was. In terms of objects protected, Entra ID, not all data protection is made equal for this. And what do I mean by that? Well, we think about Entra ID, we think about users, we think about groups, but there's so much more to Entra ID than that. So let's just have a nice little breakdown of what Veeam Data Cloud is protecting within Entra ID. So when this launched, we were protecting users, groups, administrative units, roles, applications, which is both app reg and enterprise app or service principals, as you might know them. And then within June, we also added support for conditional access policies as well. So we are continuing to expand the amount of different data types we're protecting within Entra ID. Now that's great from an object perspective, but that's not all we're protecting. We're also protecting Entra ID logs in the form of audit logs and sign-in logs. Now, some of this is going to be controlled based on how you license your Entra ID tenant, nothing to do with Veeam having different license SKUs, but just from what Microsoft will make available. So, for example, if you're trying to protect sign-in logs or conditional access policies, you are going to need Entra ID Premium within your tenant. Now, let's go into a bit more of the functionality that's available here. So if I wanted to do a bulk restore, I'm just going to select a bunch of users. You'll see I've got 20 on the screen here, and I choose restore. And you'll see here I get a list of all those users, and you might be thinking, well, why are you showing me those users again? I just selected them. Well, what we're doing here is we're able to change the restore point of those users. So by default, we're going to choose the latest restore point. But if you had a ransomware scenario that took place towards the end of the previous week, well, ransomware is only one of the final stages where it's going to be deployed alongside account lockouts, for example. If they have truly compromised that tenant. So restoring back to the last night isn't necessarily going to help me. So we can revoke that back to a previous point in time. But again, not all users might be compromised at the same time, and I might need to adapt each user based on a different point in time. So you'll see here, by selecting them all, I can choose restore point, and then I can go back from my granular day-by-day perspective and choose a date. And what we'll do as well is we'll make sure that those users did still exist at that point in time, and we'll give you a warning if that hasn't happened. If there's any users I need to override with a different date or time, I can select those individually and choose those restore points, so we can blend these different restore points together. So for now, I'm just going to keep that with all of my different users selected. And then if I go to next, what you'll see here is my restore options. So the restore mode, let's start with that. How do I want to handle the objects restore? So you'll see here we've got skip and we've got overwrite. And what is this really referring to? So with regards to skip, we're saying, okay, are we just trying to bring back any user accounts that might be deleted? If I've got tens of thousands of users and I know that compromise has taken place, potentially a script has run, nothing malicious where I need to get, third-party analytics involved or any forensics, but instead I just need to recover that data. Well, if I choose skip, then we're just going to say, okay, let's bring anything back in that doesn't exist anymore, but skip over the rest. Then you'll see we've got overwrite, full object restore. So from this perspective, say I have run a script and I've not deleted the users, but potentially I've overwritten a bunch of attributes for everyone. I've not scoped the script properly. In that scenario, what we can do is say, okay, let's reset all of these attributes back to how they were in last night's backup, as an example. And in terms of passwords, you'll see there's a couple options here. We've got set a default password for all users. Now, if we're being honest, in the year 2025, should we have a default password for all users? Probably not. Okay, but instead we can set unique passwords for every user. So I'll select that here, and you'll see I've got every single user. I've got these unique passwords that have been generated. And if I choose to regenerate, you'll then see that they are completely different. I can export this out and I'll get CSV so I can communicate those passwords individually and effectively. It's worth mentioning that if I apply this, one of the warnings you'll then see is ensure you save the passwords. This data is not accessible later. We're not holding on to those passwords for you. Okay, export them out and then work with them. One of the other things you can do here, if I was to be resetting some users and potentially they've got some administrative roles, then I might decide that I want to override that password and set something even more complex, for example. So I can select any user, edit, and I can set their password there manually. So moving on from that, you'll then see the password reset condition. We can enforce that password reset at user next sign-in. In terms of the advanced options here, reason for restore. If you've got an internal ticket system, then maybe you just want to pop in the ticket. So if anyone says, what was going on there? Because we have auditing within our solution, you can then say, okay, well, this is the ticket that the restore was related to. And then that way it improves that traceability. Now, you'll see here a couple of other options. We've got keep relationships and restore from Entra ID recycle bin. Let's talk about those. So Entra ID is a relational system. Users will be members of groups. They will have role assignments. They might be within an administrative unit. All of those relationships we track and can restore within Entra ID. So if I was in a scenario where I've accidentally deleted a user, or maybe I've just purged that group membership, I can restore those relationships back as well. Much more comprehensive recovery experience. And then finally, you see here, restore from Entra ID recycle bin. And this is relating to us using an object if it's still in the recycle bin, as opposed to regenerating a new object from scratch. Now, why might that be useful? Well, first of all, things such as GUIDs, they can't be written. Some data we will be able to back up, but we cannot write back because Microsoft don't permit it for anyone. And some data we can't even read. So that's very useful when it comes to things like app registrations, enterprise apps. And this is something that when I talk to customers, they find surprising, but let me reframe it. app registrations, we can't access the secrets or the certificates. And you might say, well, I want to protect those, and that's great. You should be protecting them. However, it would be a much wider security risk if you could, via this API, pull out every single app secret certificate and potentially start to impersonate these different apps. Okay, it's not something that we really want. So in that scenario, we can't read that data to back it up. However, if we use an existing app regis object, then it means that that secret, that certificate still exists within the object, and we can just merge back in the rest of the information. So providing the most comprehensive recovery as possible. And when I go next, you'll see a final summary screen, and I can choose restore, and that would then kick off my restore for me. Okay, so one of the next things I want to talk about, because that's great for bulk restorations effectively, but what happens on a more day-to-day basis? So something that I want to discuss now is what happens if, I'll just go back to the main home screen, let's start that again. So if I wanted to go through and restore just an individual user, for example, and not necessarily restore their entire object, but change attributes back. Potentially I've made a mistake. Things such as attributes with an Entra ID, they're not actually tracked in a recycle bin manner. You know, we talk about this a bit with Microsoft 365, how things such as columns within a list, if you delete them, they're gone. And it is the same with attributes. There's no version history being kept within Entra ID. So if I go into objects here, so just off screen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find my user Adele, and I'm going to change some of her attributes. So I'm just opening that object up now, and let's just change some of her contact information. And let's add in another number there. Okay, so I've just saved that. Now, if I choose Adele, what I can do is I can choose compare and restore. And what this will allow me to then do is look at Adele's object live within Entra ID, and then look at my latest backup point in time. And we can then compare to see any of those attributes that have changed. By default, we will only show the changes. However, it's possible to disable this as well, and then we can just view all of the attributes. You can see here, I added a phone number under business phones, I changed department, and I changed job title. And I can select any of these attributes. It hasn't got to be all of them, and I can restore them back. And if I unfilter these show changes only, you'll then see that comprehensive list of attributes that we are protecting for those users. And one of the things that I want to highlight here is, okay, that's great from a latest backup to live perspective. However, what happens if we need to track changes over time? That's not a problem for us. So you can change the restore point you're looking at. So I mentioned that one of my earliest backups was back in May. So let's go back to May, and let's have a look at that very first restore point, and then let's see everything that has changed between May and live. And whilst that's loading, something else to highlight is we don't actually just have to do comparisons between a previous backup point in time and live. What you can do here, you can't see it just while it's loading, but that little bit of text there that says production, you'll notice in this column, it's got a date and time. That's because we can select where it says production, and we can change that to a backup point in time as well. So that will allow us to compare restore point by restore point. So you can see here, anything that's been edited, anything that's been added, it's all being tracked there for us, okay? If I go back to show changes only, we'll then see that condensed list once more. So with that in mind, I choose the attributes that I want, and then I get a confirmation, and that's it, away we go. Suddenly, we're restoring. So you can see here, everything that's been edited or added, I could just select all of those, I'll choose next, give a restore reason again, and then kick off that restore, okay? So we'll cancel out of this, and the next thing I just want to highlight is this bulk restore, this compare and restore functionality. You'll notice these buttons exist across groups, across administrative units, roles, applications, conditional access policies. It is comprehensive recovery throughout this product. You'll notice that it doesn't exist with Entra ID logs. Instead, we can just export those logs, and that is by design. You don't want us merging any historical log data back into your logs. In such a scenario, we're effectively compromising the integrity of your Entra ID audit and sign-in logs, and no one wants that. But instead, we can provide that as an export. It's JSON compliant, so that you can then import that into any security tooling that you're going to need to work with. And if you ever did have a ransomware incident, again, a cyber incident of any kind there where you need to get some cyber forensics involved, that way you've got that full historical view and not just what Microsoft offer you from a retention out of the box. Speaking of retention, if I just dive over to settings here, you'll see here that we support retention of up to 99 years, okay, with a daily backup frequency. So when we think about that comparison that I showed you, you could go back 99 years day by day to see those differences as to what is changing your objects over time. So I'm just going to go over to the activity view. This is split up into two categories, backup sessions and resource sessions. So I could go in and see the details of any of my backups. So if there was a warning, it's very easy for me to investigate that. If I go over to resource sessions, you'll then see any tasks that I have performed from a restore, whether it's downloading audit logs, sign-in logs, doing a comparison of user attributes and then restoring that, or just a bulk restore. You'll see the restore reason and you can view the details here. Now this is really important because this log is immutable, and this then gives you that guarantee that if anyone has been using Veeam Data Cloud to make changes, you can then see exactly who has done what, when. So it's really detailed as well. You can see here's the who, it's myself. You can see the when, that's the date and time. You can see which objects I was working with, which attributes I was working with. So again, that granular detail that's really important. And then you can see a restore reason. So I put in my ticket request, my ticket reference, I put in that reason, and then we can see all of that success there. Now, a couple of final things just to wrap up on here for Entra ID. So something that's worth highlighting is our Veeam Intelligence for Entra ID, because again, we're adding functionality all the time here. We're pushing out updates an average of every 2 to 3 weeks, okay? And you've got other things to do with your life than just focused on what's new with Veeam Data Cloud. So by training our intelligence tools on Veeam documentation, Veeam best practices, you can ask it things such as, are there any workloads that I'm not protecting? Think back to where I mentioned we added support for conditional access policies. You can ask it that and it can tell you you're not protecting conditional access policies. Go here to enable it. We give you a bunch of prompts out of the box. You can see, how do I see details of a restore session? The idea here is to help you use the tool as easily as possible. So a couple of final things that we'll just go to. Let's talk about the RBAC now. So if I go to my users view, you can see here I've got a few users invited into my tenant. And if I invite another user, you'll see here that I've got a really powerful RBAC model. So I can, at the top level, give someone an organization admin view where they get admin over everything. They can be a viewer where they can just see that top layer. And then I can grant service-specific restoration capabilities. So Entra ID administrator, and I mentioned very early on this scenario of what happens if I've got a merger or acquisition and suddenly I've got another tenant that I'm protecting. So I add them in, I get my initial backup, but I might still have the existing IT team needing to manage that tenant and my centralized IT team managing both the old tenant and the new tenant. So in that scenario, anyone that's going to be managing both tenants, they can have access to all. Anyone that's only managing that specific tenant, I can go to selected workload tenants. I can choose specific tenants, and then we've scoped what data they're allowed access to. So I can still keep it within one Veeam Data Cloud organization for the convenience, for the centralized license management, while still having segregation of data. So that is a brief tour of Veeam Data Cloud for Entra ID. Now let's talk about what's new with Veeam Data Cloud for Microsoft 365. So the next thing I would like to show you here is if I just dive into changelog, we've got a new changelog portal. So you can just see the URL here, veeam.com/veeam-data-cloud/changelog. Don't worry about the rest of that because I want to explain it here. Our changelog is for everything within our unified experience. So there are still some customers on the legacy experience and we're actively working to move those across as soon as possible. However, it's important to mention here that with this changelog, we've got a unified experience, we have a unified log. So I can filter my workloads to choose just the ones that I'm interested in, which is why my URL has got workloads M365, workloads Entra ID. So what I've done here is I've just ticked the services that I have that I'm interested in, and I've bookmarked that. I can then filter by different categories. I can look at date ranges, and you can see whenever we pushed out different updates here as to what has been taking place. Now, for Microsoft 365, it's been mainly a maintenance and stability month. We've had some new patches come out, even on the VV365 perspective as well. But again, there's a lot going on behind the scenes to make things faster, more efficient, and more responsive than ever before. And then we've got some real big key milestones coming up in the coming months, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about them all then. But for now, that's it from me. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you in the next video.